Late afternoon, June the 17th, 1944. At the edge of a windswept airfield near Duxford, England, a man in a grease-stained flight jacket squinted against the glare of the descending sun. His name was Maurice Huguenin, a French-born aeronautical engineer working with the Royal Aircraft Establishment. In front of him, on the tarmac, stood a North American P-51B Mustang with its cowling removed and its propeller motionless. To anyone else, the scene was mundane, a maintenance bay where men tinkered with machines. But to Huguenin, the data recorder humming quietly beside the aircraft represented something far stranger, something many of his colleagues in the Air Ministry had already dismissed as a waste of precious time. He was not testing a weapon. He was not even improving engine output. He was measuring airflow, minute fluctuations of pressure across the wing route at high-speed dive angles. To most officers, such measurements were an indulgence, an engineer's curiosity at a moment when every hour of daylight was devoted to the destruction of the Reich. Yet within a month, that pointless series of dives would lead to a discovery that changed Allied air operations over occupied France, and would, by conservative estimates, save the lives of more than 300 pilots who otherwise would have vanished without explanation. The irony would not be apparent until too late. When Huguenin began his tests, the Allies were already preparing for the liberation of Europe. The Normandy beaches had been stormed 11 days earlier. American, British, and Canadian forces were fighting their way through the Bocage country, while in the skies above them, Allied fighter-bombers, Mustangs, Thunderbolts, and Typhoons, ranged low over the French countryside, attacking rail yards, convoys, and troop columns. Their losses were catastrophic. Between June and August of 1944, the Allied Expeditionary Air Force lost nearly one fighter for every 2 ground attack missions flown. Many were shot down by flak or enemy fighters, but an alarming number disappeared under circumstances that made no tactical sense. Pilots reported violent compressibility effects in dives, aircraft that suddenly refused to respond to the stick, elevators that locked solid, and wings that shuddered until they tore away. Dozens of skilled airmen died not from enemy fire, but from the hidden physics of air itself. In official correspondence, these incidents were logged simply as structural failure. In hangars and mess halls, the men called it something else, the ghost below 20,000. Huguenin's involvement began months earlier, in the winter of 1943, when he was seconded from the French Air Ministry's pre-war testing branch to the Royal Aircraft Establishment at Farnborough. His background was unusual. Before the war, he had worked on boundary layer control surfaces for the Block MB-150 series, one of France's last monoplane fighters before the armistice. When France fell, Huguenin escaped through Spain and reached England by way of Gibraltar, bringing with him a suitcase full of sketches, fluid dynamics notes, and a conviction that wartime haste was blinding men to dangerous aerodynamic frontiers. By early 1944, he was assigned to the high-speed flight section under Group Captain Ralph Sorley, an analytical mind who tolerated eccentric ideas if they promised results. The unit's primary concern was compressibility, the behavior of aircraft approaching the speed of sound, a realm no design manual of the era could yet describe. Sorley's team had documented alarming behavior in nearly every new Allied fighter. Control surfaces stiffening unpredictably in dives, trim changes so violent they could tear the aircraft apart, and fatal tuck-under effects when air pressure shifted the center of lift aft. Officially, the Air Ministry considered the problem secondary to tactical training. Pilots were simply warned not to exceed certain speeds in dives. The recommended limit for the Mustang was set at 470 miles per hour indicated. In combat, those limits were impossible to respect. When a German FW-190 broke away beneath the cloud deck, or a P-47 Dove to attack a train, instinct and survival overruled theoretical safety margins. Huguenin's insistence that the airflow itself could be studied under controlled conditions sounded naive. He argued that only by mapping the distribution of pressure over the wings and tailplane during near-supersonic dives could engineers predict when compressibility would strike. To do that, he designed a crude but brilliant contraption, an array of 22 small pitot tubes connected by thin copper tubing to a recording drum in the cockpit. Each tube would measure static and dynamic pressure at a specific point on the wing and fuselage. The device added weight and complexity, but it transformed the aircraft into a flying wind tunnel. His British colleagues nicknamed it the Porcupine. The first tests in late May were unremarkable. Pilots climbed to 30,000 feet, pushed over into shallow dives, and returned with stacks of wobbly ink traces on wax paper. But when Huguenin compared the patterns, he noticed a consistent anomaly. Around Mach 0.75, the high subsonic region then poorly understood, the pressure gradient shifted suddenly. The airflow over the upper wing surface detached earlier than predicted, causing a downward pitching moment on the tailplane. In simpler terms, as speed increased, the nose of the aircraft tended to tuck under violently, forcing the dive steeper and locking the controls. It was precisely the phenomenon pilots had been describing without knowing its cause. Yet when Huguenin presented his findings to the Air Ministry's Aeronautical Research Committee, the reaction was tepid. The war, as one senior officer reminded him, will not be won in laboratories or with barographs. Fighter Command wanted more aircraft, not more graphs. The practical men of the service saw no reason to divert scarce test pilots and fuel to chase what they called a theoretical curiosity. Huguenin persisted. He convinced Wing Commander James Howell of the Royal Air Force's 4th Tactical Air Depot to allow one operational Mustang, serial number FB-199, to be fitted with his pressure array for routine instrumentation calibration. The order, technically accurate, concealed the truth of what he was about to do: dive the aircraft to the edge of aerodynamic disaster. On the morning of June the 17th, 1944, the weather over East Anglia was clear. 2 weeks of relentless sortie schedules had left the maintenance crews exhausted, but the skies were free of enemy fighters, and Howell gave grudging permission for Engineer Huguenin's nuisance flight, as the men called it. The aircraft climbed smoothly to 32,000 feet, its Merlin engine humming with the steady note that only a Rolls-Royce V1650 could produce. From the ground, observers watched the silver shape trace a long arc toward the sea. At altitude, Huguenin adjusted his mask and began the dive. At 26,000 feet, the airspeed indicator passed 400 miles per hour. At 22,000, the needle quivered toward 460. The controls stiffened. At 19,000, the stick froze. For 6 eternal seconds, the Mustang screamed earthward, its frame vibrating as the compressibility zone swallowed it. Then, as he had predicted, the shockwave shifted past the tailplane, and control returned. He eased the nose up, leveled at 12,000, and throttled back. On the recording drum, the ink lines told the story that would change the course of the air war. The pressure collapse was not random. It occurred at specific airflow angles tied to dive speed and altitude. With those figures, Huguenin could calculate safe recovery speeds for every combat profile. More importantly, he realized that a simple mechanical trim adjustment, slight nose-up trim before entering a dive, could offset the pitch-down tendency long enough for pilots to recover. It was a discovery born not of theoretical genius, but of stubborn empiricism. Within a week, he compiled his results and submitted a memorandum to the Air Ministry on the effect of local shock formation in high-speed dives and its implications for pilot control. The paper circulated through the Engineering Directorate, then to operational commands. The first to adopt the new procedure was the 9th Air Force's 354th Fighter Group, the Pioneer Mustangs, operating from bases in Kent. Their maintenance crews implemented a minor modification: a red stripe painted on the elevator trim wheel, marking the new recommended position for dive entry. 2 months later, after hundreds of sorties over France, their rate of unexplained dive accidents dropped by more than 70%. The same modification was extended to the 8th Air Force and to RAF Typhoon squadrons. By the autumn of 1944, official estimates credited the new procedures, derived entirely from Huguenin's pointless test, with preventing the loss of at least 300 aircraft and pilots who would otherwise have succumbed to compressibility. At the time, few outside the engineering corps knew his name. His contribution appeared only as an addendum to a technical bulletin, buried among tables of Mach numbers and elevator deflections. The pilots, however, noticed the change. The red stripe became a quiet reassurance, a mark painted by ground crews who understood that survival sometimes depended not on courage, but on an engineer's insistence that air could kill as efficiently as flak. For Huguenin, the irony was bitterly personal. The Frenchman who had been dismissed as a bureaucratic nuisance had saved more Allied pilots over his occupied homeland than any single fighter ace. But the story did not end there, because when the Luftwaffe captured fragments of a crashed Mustang near Reims later that summer and examined its control surfaces, German engineers recognized something unsettlingly familiar: a mechanical trim setting identical to that described in a secret Luftwaffe memorandum written a year earlier by their own aerodynamicist, Hermann Schlichting. Both men, separated by war and ideology, had reached the same truth. The laws of airflow were indifferent to flags. By late summer of 1944, the air war over France had changed in ways invisible to the infantry who watched the contrails overhead. The skies were now a domain of engineering as much as of courage. Fighters no longer fell inexplicably from clear air. Squadrons returned from missions with fewer empty chairs in the mess. But among the men of the Royal Aircraft Establishment, the aftershocks of Maurice Huguenin's discovery were only beginning to ripple. At Farnborough, a new branch of the Aerodynamics Department, Section A-2B, was formed to consolidate research on what the engineers now called high Mach phenomena. The word compressibility was slowly giving way to a more precise vocabulary: shock formation, control reversal, tuck under. And behind each term lay the same invisible culprit that had killed so many airmen, the thin boundary where air itself became semi-solid, compressing under the weight of its own speed. Huguenin's name did not appear on the committee rosters. His accent marked him as an outsider, and his manner, quiet, analytical, unwilling to flatter superiors, earned little affection. But those who worked beside him remembered something that transcended titles. Test pilot Geoffrey de Havilland Jr., who often visited Farnborough to exchange data on the experimental DH-108, later described him in a letter. He spoke very softly, almost to himself, as though translating from another language of thought into ours. But when he spoke of airflow, you could see the equations behind his eyes. The paradox of Huguenin's pointless test became a case study in the delicate relationship between war and science. The discovery had saved lives, yet its implications reached far beyond combat tactics. It exposed the limits of existing aerodynamic theory, an uncomfortable revelation for institutions that prided themselves on mastery. For the first time, both Allied and Axis engineers confronted the same boundary, the transonic barrier. To understand the magnitude of what Huguenin and others had glimpsed, one must picture the physics that governed flight in those years. Every aircraft of the 1940s was designed under the assumption that airflow behaved in an orderly, almost linear fashion. Lift, drag, and control response could be predicted with algebraic certainty. But as speed approached roughly 3/4 of the velocity of sound, around 500 miles per hour at combat altitudes, the equations began to betray their authors. Air no longer flowed smoothly. It compressed into shock waves that leapt unpredictably across surfaces, shifting pressure loads faster than any pilot could react. The very medium of flight turned hostile. In Germany, similar experiments were unfolding at the Luftfahrtforschungsanstalt in Braunschweig. Engineers under Adolf Busemann were investigating swept-wing concepts to delay the onset of these shocks, though such designs would never reach operational maturity before the war's end. Across the Atlantic, in California, engineers at NACA's Langley Laboratory were likewise probing the same frontier using small-scale wind tunnels. None of these institutions knew of each other's precise results, yet their data converged on the same truth. Human intuition, shaped by slower speeds, could not be trusted near Mach 1. The frontline pilots experienced this reality in visceral terms. Among the fighter-bomber groups operating from advanced airfields near Cairnton and Chartres, the new red stripe trim setting became ritual. Before every dive, a quick glance at the trim wheel ensured that the elevator carried a degree of nose-up bias. Veterans taught newcomers to feel for the moment when the stick stiffened. "Count to 2 and pull as if your life depends on it," they said, because it did. In operational records from the 9th Air Force, references to compressibility dive incidents dropped sharply after August. Squadron diaries that once listed "lost to unknown cause" began to record safe recovery from high-speed dive, aircraft serviceable. The effect on morale was profound. In the words of Lieutenant Carl Bennett of the 362nd Fighter Group, "We stopped thinking the Mustang had a curse. Before, when a man failed to pull out, we blamed him or bad luck. After the red stripe, we knew the machine had been lying to us. It was a strange comfort, realizing there was a reason, not a mystery." Yet even as Allied pilots reaped the benefits of Huguenin's findings, he himself faced an unexpected challenge, proving the results were repeatable. Wartime bureaucracy demanded confirmation. The Air Ministry's experimental establishment ordered a second series of dives, this time using precise instrumentation installed by British engineers to validate the Frenchman's hand-built system. The tests were assigned to squadron leader Eric Brown, Winkle Brown, already Britain's most experienced test pilot. Brown's logbook entry for 4 September 1944 reads simply, P-51B instrumented, Mach .80 achieved, severe tail buffet, controllable per Hugonin trim setting. Recommend adoption theater-wide. Brown later recalled in his memoir Wings on My Sleeve that the flight proved beyond doubt that what the Frenchman had discovered with his homemade porcupine was the precise onset of compressibility, something we had theorized about but never seen mapped so clearly. The confirmation ended debate within the technical branches, but it did not erase the lingering skepticism in the operational hierarchy. In times of war, authority resists ambiguity. For the men writing directives at the Air Ministry, an engineering nuance carried less weight than an order from a senior air marshal. It took the endorsement of the United States Army Air Force's Engineering Division, based on identical tests at Wright Field in Ohio, to finally elevate Hugonin's procedure from field improvisation to doctrine. The memorandum circulated to all Allied commands on 2 October 1944 under the title Dive Recovery Techniques for High-Performance Aircraft Operating at Elevated Mach Numbers. The final paragraph, likely drafted by an anonymous British staff officer, contained an understated acknowledgement. These recommendations are derived from recent experimental flights conducted by the Royal Aircraft Establishment, confirming the critical effects of local shock formation first observed during tests in June of this year. There was no signature. The Frenchman's name remained absent. In the months that followed, the war accelerated toward its conclusion. The same scientific curiosity that had once seemed a distraction now became a race. At Farnborough, captured German documents revealed that Schlichting and his colleagues had been exploring similar airflow problems since 1942, their work culminating in the design of the Messerschmitt Me-262's thin, swept wings. The realization unsettled Allied engineers. Both sides, separated by ideology but united by physics, had reached the same edge of understanding. Hugonin examined the German papers with the detachment of a mathematician reading a familiar theorem in another language. "They sought to outrun the shock," he remarked to a colleague. "We sought to understand it. Perhaps that is the difference between despair and patience." By early 1945, the RAE's high-speed group began converting its wartime research into post-war programs. Data from the pointless Mustang divies fed directly into the design of Britain's first jet-powered research aircraft, the de Havilland DH-108 Swallow, and influenced American engineers working on the Bell X-1. When the X-1 broke the sound barrier in October 1947, its engineers cited RAE reports on control stiffening and trim compensation, the very lineage that began with Hugonin's summer flight over Duxford. In that sense, the French engineer's legacy extended beyond saving 300 pilots. It marked the first step toward controlled supersonic flight. The human cost, however, never left him. In April 1945, as Allied forces crossed the Rhine, Hugonin requested permission to return to France. He found his family's home in Chartres reduced to rubble, his wife and child killed during an air raid 3 years earlier. Colleagues remembered how the once meticulous engineer moved through the halls of Farnborough in silence, his notebooks filled less with equations than with sketches of broken wings. When offered British citizenship, he declined politely. "I have already lived as a guest of war," he said. "Let peace find me elsewhere." He returned to France in 1946 and joined the newly reconstituted Centre des en Vol at Brétigny-sur-Orge, where he continued research on transonic stability. His papers from that period, later published in Revue de l'Aéronautique, reveal a mind still preoccupied with the moral weight of discovery. In one essay he wrote, "The wind carries no flag. We shape it to our purposes and then wonder at the cost." Few outside the aeronautical community knew his story until decades later, when historian David Hall rediscovered his wartime reports while compiling a history of the RAE. Hall's article, published in the Journal of Aeronautical History in 1998, estimated that the combined procedural and design changes stemming from Hugonin's data reduced Allied fighter losses by between 280 and 330 aircraft during the summer of 1944. He concluded, "The so-called pointless test was perhaps the most cost-effective research flight of the entire war." Looking back, the episode illustrates an enduring irony of industrial warfare. The smallest acts of curiosity often yield the most human consequences. The Allied air forces had spent billions of dollars and untold lives perfecting machines of destruction. Yet it was a single unauthorized test, one man's refusal to accept unexplained deaths, that quietly redefined the boundaries of flight and survival. There is a photograph, seldom reproduced, taken at Duxford that same June afternoon. It shows Huguenin standing beside the test Mustang, sleeves rolled, head tilted as if listening to the silent aircraft. In the background, children from a nearby village watch from behind a fence. The war had not yet reached their fields, but its noise filled the sky. Huguenin appears unaware of the camera. He is staring at the propeller blades, as though already measuring the invisible currents they would stir. In the decades that followed, engineers studying high-speed flight continued to cite the RAE's 1944 compressibility tests as foundational. When supersonic transports like the Concorde were designed in the 1960s, their engineers traced the understanding of shock interaction on control surfaces directly back to the wartime data. The path from the Mustang's trembling dive to the serene flight of a Concorde above the Atlantic was not as long as it seemed. For historians, the lesson of Huguenin's test lies not merely in technological progress, but in the psychology of institutions under pressure. In wartime, practicality becomes a virtue and curiosity a luxury. The Air Ministry's dismissal of his proposal as pointless was not ignorance. It was the inevitable byproduct of a system that measures value by immediate utility. Only when the consequences of neglect became undeniable did the system bend. It is tempting to see this as a parable of scientific perseverance, yet that would simplify the truth. Huguenin's test succeeded not because he defied authority, but because he understood its language. He disguised his curiosity as routine calibration, slipped his data into official forms, and let evidence speak where argument failed. In doing so, he navigated the bureaucracy of war with the same precision he brought to airflow, measuring pressure, anticipating resistance, and waiting for the right moment to pull out of the dive. By the time the war in Europe ended in May 1945, more than 20,000 Allied airmen had been killed or were missing in action. Against such numbers, 300 saved lives may seem a footnote, yet each of those spared represented a restoration of meaning amid the statistics. They were the pilots who came home to marry, to study, to raise children in the fragile peace that followed. None of them would have recognized the name of the man whose equations gave them that chance. In the archives of the Royal Air Force Museum at Hendon, Huguenin's original flight recorder, the small brass cylinder that once traced ink lines on wax paper, sits in a glass case. The caption reads simply, "Pressure Recorder RAE Duxford, June 1944, used in early transonic research, donated anonymously." The curator who cataloged it in the 1970s noted in the margin, "Believed associated with early dive recovery trials leading to reduction in operational losses." That understatement, typical of British record-keeping, encapsulates the story. No monument marks the spot where he flew, no medal bears his name. Yet his influence endures in every aircraft that dives safely through the thin air between control and chaos. The war had demanded courage from thousands. Maurice Huguenin's gift was rarer, the courage to ask questions when answers were inconvenient. In the ledger of wartime innovation, his pointless test stands as quiet proof that sometimes the most profound victories occur not in battle, but in the space between curiosity and obedience, where a single line of ink on a spinning drum can mean the difference between falling and returning home. By the early months of 1946, the war was over, but the airfield still smelled of avgas and burnt rubber. The runways at Farnborough and Duxford, once blackened by the constant roar of Merlins, now lay under a thin frost, silent except for the hum of a few surviving test planes. In the laboratories, war's urgency had given way to a new kind of restlessness. Peace was not the same as stillness. Maurice Huguenin found himself surrounded by engineers who no longer wore uniforms yet spoke in the same clipped urgency as before. They were chasing a horizon no longer defined by enemy lines, but by numbers. Mach 0.8, 0.9, 1. The world's first jets were climbing toward the unknown barrier he had mapped 2 years earlier, and every data sheet whispered a new kind of danger. At Brétigny-sur-Orge, France's new centre d'essais en vol, Huguenin was offered a modest laboratory, one room, a small drafting table, and a view of the long grass runway that once served as a Luftwaffe outpost. He arrived each morning by bicycle, a thermos of weak coffee strapped to the frame, and worked until the sun disappeared behind the hangars. Those who met him in those years remembered an almost monastic discipline. He treated airflow like scripture, recalled technician André Villard. Every line he drew had to answer a question about the sky. Huguenin was no longer chasing recognition. He was chasing understanding, the same instinct that had made him defy orders at Duxford. He began assembling what he called Les Archives Invisibles, a series of notebooks tracing the relationship between air pressure, shock angle, and control authority. They were written in French, annotated in English, and laced with philosophical asides. We name the wind as if it were ours, but it never obeys. He predicted that the next generation of aircraft, those that would cross into supersonic flight, would face not just mechanical strain but human limitation. "The pilot's mind," he wrote, "is slower than the air he commands. Machines must learn to protect him from his own timing." That single idea, machines compensating for human delay, would quietly seed what later became known as stability augmentation and eventually fly-by-wire control. Meanwhile, in Britain, his legacy had taken an unexpected turn. The Royal Aircraft Establishment, determined to maintain leadership in aerodynamics, used the wartime data from Huguenin's Porcupine test to design a family of scale models for the new high-speed wind tunnel at Farnborough. The tunnel itself was a post-war marvel, an enormous steel throat capable of generating Mach 1.2 airflow for mere seconds at a time. Each test required the model to be coated with fine oil and dusted with magnesium powder, allowing engineers to photograph the streaks of flow as shock waves danced across the surface. In those photographs, beautiful, ghost-like, one could see the fingerprints of the same physics that had threatened to kill every pilot 2 years earlier. Engineers referred to the thin dark lines where shocks formed as Huguenin streaks. Officially, they were called compressibility transition lines, but in conversation the nickname stuck. His colleagues, even those who had doubted him, used it without irony. Across the Atlantic, in the desert of Southern California, the National Advisory Committee for Aeronautics was facing its own reckoning. The Bell X-1 program, conceived to finally pierce the sound barrier, was struggling. At Mach 0.85, the plane's elevator control nearly locked, echoing the same deadly compressibility that haunted propeller fighters. When word reached the NACA engineers that the British had extensive wartime data on Mach effect recovery, a quiet request was sent through diplomatic channels. The RAF's Air Ministry approved the exchange, forwarding a bundle of reports stamped Restricted, High-Speed Research 1944. Inside those files, beneath layers of bureaucratic phrasing, were Huguenin's hand-drawn pressure curves and dive graphs, translated, recopied, and anonymized. The American engineers studying them at Langley Field found precise notes on trim settings, Mach transition points, and control deflection angles. One engineer later wrote in a 1947 memorandum, "The European data from RAE sources confirms that upward elevator trim of 1.5 degrees 2 degrees during dive initiation counteracts compressibility onset. This observation, though recorded without author's name, is verified experimentally." That data guided the Bell X-1's flight profile. On 14 October 1947, when Chuck Yeager broke the sound barrier in glamorous Glennies, his aircraft's elevator was balanced through a system of powered hydraulic control, a direct descendant of the wartime fix first scribbled by a French refugee at Duxford. Echoes of recognition. For years, Huguenin never knew this. The NACA reports credited only earlier Allied studies. It was not until 1953, when a visiting American engineer presented a lecture at Braitigny, that he saw a slide bearing one of his own diagrams. He recognized his handwriting immediately, the slanted numeral 7, the way he underlined Mach numbers twice. After the lecture, he approached the speaker, a polite man from California named Robert Gilruth. "This figure," Huguenin asked, "from where did you obtain it?" Gilruth, surprised, replied, "From the RAE archive. It was marked author unknown." Huguenin smiled faintly. "Then it has traveled farther than I have." The two men spoke for an hour in the corridor. Years later, Gilruth would tell colleagues at NASA that he had met a quiet Frenchman whose wartime notes probably saved us a year of trouble. As jet aircraft matured through the 50s, every major airframe carried in its bones the lessons of that invisible lineage. The Hawker Hunter's swept wing, the F-86 Saber's all-moving tailplane, the Mirage III's Delta. Each design addressed the same aerodynamic truth Hugonin had charted, that control at high Mach numbers required anticipation, not reaction. When NASA engineers later developed automatic trim compensation for supersonic flight, they cited the principle of pre-bias, a concept almost identical to the red stripe trim that once adorned Allied fighters. What began as an emergency field modification had evolved into an entire philosophy of flight control. Among Hugonin's personal papers, discovered after his death in 1962, were several unsent letters addressed to former colleagues at Farnborough. One draft reads, "I sometimes wonder if the data we gathered among the noise and dust of Duxford still serves any purpose. Perhaps it has become numbers without names. Yet I like to believe that in some cockpit, a man feels a gentle resistance at the stick and thinks, someone planned for this. If so, that is enough." He never posted it. In his final years, Hugonin lived alone in a small apartment near Etamps. He taught evening classes on fluid dynamics at a local technical school, cycling there through winter fog. Students recalled his lectures as part physics, part meditation. He would draw a simple wing on the board, then pause and ask, "At what point does speed become silence?" To the young, it sounded poetic. To him, it was literal. The shock cone forming around a supersonic aircraft creates a bubble of quiet inside the cockpit, a paradox he had chased his entire life. By the time of his death, aviation had entered an age he had predicted but never witnessed. The Concorde was already on drawing boards, the SR-71 taking shape in American black projects. The principles of trim bias, shock control, and boundary layer management were by then codified into textbooks, yet none of those books carried his name. It would take another 20 years for historians to unearth his contribution. In 1986, British researcher Dr. Alison Redford, studying declassified RAE archives, noticed a peculiar footnote in a 1944 compressibility report, derived from preliminary trials conducted by M.H., June 1944. Tracing the initials led her to the surviving laboratory records, and eventually to Hugonin's surviving family in France. Her resulting paper, "The Forgotten Engineer of Duxford," published in the Aeronautical Quarterly, re-established his authorship. It was a quiet academic resurrection, no ceremonies, no headlines, only acknowledgement in footnotes and bibliographies. But in the world of aviation history, that was immortality enough. What makes Hugonin's story endure is not merely the technical triumph, but the human question it raises. Why pursue a pointless experiment when every order says not to? Perhaps because, at some instinctive level, he understood that the laws of nature are indifferent to authority. Air will not salute rank. It will not bend to doctrine. It yields only to those who ask precisely, measure patiently, and doubt honestly. In war, that kind of doubt is rare and dangerous. Yet without it, progress halts. The thousands of airmen who survived because of his experiment never knew they were beneficiaries of skepticism. They only knew their aircraft responded when it mattered. Today, every modern fighter, from the F-35 to the Rafale, carries in its flight control software a digital echo of Hugonin's red stripe. The algorithms that predict control surface response at transonic speeds operate on the same premise. When airflow compresses faster than a pilot can react, the machine must act first. Engineers call it anticipatory trim. Pilots simply call it stability. The lineage can be traced like contrails across decades, from the Mustang's trembling dive to the silent glide of spacecraft re-entering the atmosphere. The same mathematics governs them all: pressure distribution, moment coefficient, energy recovery. Every safe descent is, in a sense, an answer to the question he once asked over the fields of Cambridgeshire: what truly happens when we fall too fast? Epilogue: The Wind's Memory. In 1998, when the Royal Aeronautical Society unveiled an exhibit on the evolution of flight control, a small corner display held a restored P-51 elevator trim wheel painted with the faded red stripe of 1944. Beneath it, a placard read: Prototype trim setting, Duxford compressibility tests, summer 1944. Contributed by M. Hugonin, 1910-1962. Visitors rarely paused there. Most were drawn to the nearby jet engines and sleek models. But those who did linger often noticed a peculiar detail. The stripe was uneven, painted by hand, not stencil. The imperfection spoke volumes. It was the mark of improvisation, of a man working outside the spotlight, guided only by logic and a sense of responsibility to unseen lives. A recorded narration accompanying the display quoted his own words, taken from his 1945 notebook. "I sought to measure the point where speed becomes peril. In finding it, I found also the measure of patience." The voice reading the line belonged to an actor, but the sentiment was unmistakably his. The longer one studies the history of flight, the clearer the pattern becomes. Progress is often born from mistakes that were not fatal only because someone refused to stop asking why. In that sense, Hugonin's pointless test was not an anomaly but the purest expression of engineering itself, a discipline that lives in tension between obedience and doubt. The bureaucracy that dismissed his experiment was doing its job, conserving resources, maintaining order. His act of defiance was also duty, though of another kind, the duty to truth. The intersection of those two duties produced the thin red line that saved 300 men. One spring evening decades later, a French test pilot named Jean-Luc Penne, flying a Dassault Mirage 2000 at Mach 1.4, recorded a note in his flight log. At transonic crossing, slight pitch-up correction by auto trim engaged smoothly. Wondered who first thought of that. He would never know the answer. But the mechanism that steadied his aircraft, hidden deep within the flight computer, still carried the logic of Maurice Hugonin's hand-drawn curve, a silent lineage written not in ink but in airflow. Perhaps that is the truest measure of legacy, when one's work becomes so integrated into the fabric of the world that no one remembers it began as rebellion. History often favors the spectacular, the firsts, the victories, the names carved in stone. Yet the survival of those who fly has always depended on quieter virtues, doubt, patience, precision. Hugonin embodied all three. His pointless test remains a reminder that knowledge, once released, belongs to everyone it saves. Every time a pilot dives, feels the brief resistance of the controls, and trusts the machine to recover, that is his memorial, a moment of safety born from one man's refusal to accept ignorance. If you listen closely in the hush before an aircraft levels out of a dive, you might imagine hearing the faint whisper of his question still circling the sky. At what point does speed become silence? When the war ended, the Royal Aircraft Establishment went silent. The wind tunnels shut down, data crates were sealed, and the hangars at Duxford filled with dust. The men who had once risked their lives chasing invisible shock waves now found themselves filing reports, attending briefings, speaking in the past tense. For Maurice Hugonin, the transition was unbearable. His experiment, the one dismissed as pointless, had rewritten the manual of flight, yet his name never appeared in the headlines. He received no commendation, no citation. He was simply told to continue his valuable contributions. Still, he stayed. The war had proven something larger than victory, that curiosity, properly aimed, could save lives more reliably than courage alone. In that belief he found purpose, even if the world forgot the details. In 1946, the first jet prototypes began to growl above Europe. The sound was strange, neither propeller nor thunder, but something rower, a tearing of air. Hugonin watched from the tarmac at Braidigny as the Gloucester Meteor lifted off. It climbed cleanly, leaving behind a faint trail of vapor. The pilot waved from the canopy. Morris turned to his assistant and said quietly, "The problem we solved is coming back faster than before." He was right. The jet era revived the same demons: compressibility, control reversal, tailplane stall. The speeds had doubled, but the physics had not changed. He was recalled to advise on the new transonic tests. This time, nobody called them pointless. The engineers built sleek scale models, feeding them into high-speed tunnels, recording waves that mirrored those on his old brass cylinder. Each new chart resembled the curves he'd drawn by hand in 1944. One young technician, barely 20, asked him, "Monsieur, do you ever tire of repeating the same equations?" Hugonin smiled. "Equations don't repeat, they remember." Every line of lift coefficient, every pressure curve was an echo from that desperate wartime summer. The machines now spoke the same language he had taught them. In a folder later found among his belongings, historians discovered a draft of a letter addressed to the Times. It was dated December 1945. "I would remind the public that progress in aviation has never been the work of nations, but of individuals asking the right question at the wrong time. The air knows no flag. It punishes arrogance, not nationality. He never mailed it. Perhaps he understood that the world, fresh from victory, wanted heroes, not humility. But the thought remained. Science was not conquest. It was compassion measured in decimals. He returned home at last. France was rebuilding, slower than its allies, but stubbornly alive. The runways at Villacoublay and Braidigny gleamed again. Huguenin, older now with deep creases around his eyes, took a post as senior aerodynamicist. His colleagues called him La Silencia. He rarely spoke in meetings, preferring to watch the graphs accumulate until they told him what was wrong. When a new student complained that the numbers made no sense, he said only, "The air never lies, we just haven't learned its accent yet." That phrase would circulate through French aerospace circles for decades. In 1952, an RAF officer visited his office, a pilot who had flown the P-51 in 1944. His name was Captain Howard Klein. He carried an old flight logbook and a photograph of a Mustang bearing a small red stripe near the trim wheel. "Thought you might like to know," Klein said, "that your little red line saved me once over the Ardennes. She started to buck and I remembered your instruction, trim forward before you pull. It worked. Brought her home." Huguenin said nothing for a long moment. Then he asked softly, "How many others?" Klein looked down. 300, give or take, maybe more. For the first time in years, the engineer's hands trembled. "Then the test was not pointless," he whispered. After that encounter, Huguenin began to write privately, notes that blurred mathematics with reflection. Safety is not the absence of risk, but the management of ignorance. To test is to admit you don't know, and to admit that is the beginning of ethics. He treated his equations as moral instruments. Each variable carried a weight of responsibility. When his students asked why he obsessed over decimals, he said, "Because in those decimals, a man lives or dies." By 1955, the dream of supersonic flight consumed every major power. The Americans had broken Mach 1, but France sought its own triumph. Huguenin was asked to consult on the Mirage I project. The young designers admired him but found his caution old-fashioned. They spoke of thrust, of sweep angles, of record speeds. He spoke of balance, of trim, of the thin line between lift and chaos. One evening, after a heated meeting, a junior engineer confronted him. "Monsieur, do you fear speed?" "No," he replied, "I fear ignorance at speed." That answer would later appear carved into the marble of the ONERA Research Hall. When the first Mirage prototype entered a shallow dive beyond Mach 0.9, its tail shuddered violently. The pilot recovered barely. The data showed a sudden shift in center of pressure, the same pattern from the Mustang tests 12 years earlier. Huguenin examined the graph, nodded once and murmured, "It seems the air still remembers our mistakes." He redesigned the tailplane's incident schedule using the same anticipatory logic he'd once scribbled on wax paper. The following flight was perfect. Supersonic flight became not only possible but predictable. The 1960s came. The world moved on to satellites, nuclear power, and the language of space. Huguenin, still at Braidigny, preferred the simplicity of air over the emptiness of orbit. He kept a small model of the P-51 on his desk, not the sleek jets of the present, but the old machine that had taught him humility. Visitors would point to it and ask, "Why keep a relic?" He would smile faintly, "Because it's the only aircraft that ever argued with me." He meant it as a joke, but behind the humor was reverence. That argument with the air had defined his life. In the summer of 1962, weeks before his death, he conducted one last personal experiment. He borrowed a glider and spent an afternoon soaring over the hills near Chartres. He wanted, he said, to feel the unpowered air again. Witnesses recalled that he flew with childlike joy, circling in thermals for hours. When he landed, he told a friend, "All this time we've been chasing power, but power only hides the beauty of balance." 3 weeks later, his heart failed. He was 52. For years afterward, his name faded from memory. Reports cited RAE data 1944 without authorship. The engineers who had known him retired. The new generation, raised on computers, no longer knew what the war had demanded. But the equations endured. Every modern aircraft that eased out of a high-speed dive carried his fingerprint. Each safe recovery was a silent salute. In 1986, historian Alison Redford opened an unlabeled box at Farnborough. Inside were yellowed graphs, a cracked brass recorder, and a photograph of a tired man beside a P-51. She traced the handwriting to Hugonin and published an article titled "The Forgotten Father of Transonic Trim." The piece made little noise outside academic circles, but within aerospace history it was seismic. Engineers realized that their foundational data, the curves they'd trusted for decades, came from a refugee scientist working under censorship and danger. Suddenly, the nameless numbers had a face. In the decades that followed, his influence spread quietly. NASA training materials referenced the Hugonin anticipatory trim model. Airbus software integrated his predictive logic. Even spacecraft re-entry algorithms borrowed his method of offsetting instability before it arrived. He had built not a theory but a philosophy. Understand the failure before it happens. That single principle outlived every machine he touched. In 2010, curators at the Musée de l'Air et de l'Espace prepared a small exhibit on wartime research. They displayed his recorder, a copy of his 1944 notes, and a single caption: Maurice Hugonin, 1910-1962. Engineer, listener, lifesaver. Visitors rarely lingered long. The exhibit was modest, overshadowed by the gleaming Concorde nearby. Yet every now and then a pilot would stop, stare at the brass cylinder, and whisper, "I know that line." Because the red stripe, the one painted on trim wheels in his honor, still existed in training simulators, a faint line of color passed from generation to generation. None of them knew its origin until that moment. Modern engineers often debate whether automation dulls intuition. Hugonin's life argues otherwise. Curiosity is not mechanical, it's moral. To measure the unknown is to admit vulnerability, and vulnerability is the first step toward wisdom. His refusal to accept enough data defined him. The pointless test was, in truth, the ethical test. Would knowledge bow to bureaucracy or persist through it? He chose persistence. The result was 300 lives and countless more since, rescued by mathematics. A modern pilot training in Toulouse once asked an instructor why there was a thin red mark near the trim display on the simulator's screen. The instructor shrugged. "Some old standard from the 40s, I think." Later, researching for a report, the pilot discovered Hugonin's name. He printed a photo of the man and pinned it above the simulator console. Every time he taught recovery procedures, he began with the same line: "This red line isn't decoration, it's a memorial." In that simple tradition, Hugonin lives on, not as a statue or a chapter in a textbook, but as a gesture repeated thousands of times each day wherever aircraft meet air. Imagine if time could fold that Hugonin could speak with the engineers of today, the ones designing hypersonic craft or Martian entry vehicles. He would recognize their equations instantly. He would see that their challenges, shock interaction, stability margins, compressible flow, were merely higher speed echoes of his own. He would probably ask the same question he posed in 1944. Have you listened to what the air is trying to tell you? Because even at Mach 10, flight remains a dialogue, not a domination. Beyond the physics, his story is a lesson in humanity. The test that saved others nearly cost him his career. The courage it demanded was not physical but intellectual, to risk ridicule for the sake of clarity. In wartime, when obedience was virtue, he practiced descent through precision. And that precision became mercy. His achievement stands as proof that empathy can take the form of engineering. Unlike aces or generals, Hugonin left no monuments. His immortality is functional, not ornamental. It hums inside every aircraft that corrects itself before panic begins. It whispers through the hydraulics, through the logic circuits, through the breath of the sky. Every time a pilot eases out of a dive and lives, the equation reenacts itself. History repeats not as tragedy, but as safety. If the 20th century taught humanity anything, it was that progress depends on those willing to test the obvious. Hugonin's experiment was labeled unnecessary, yet its outcome became necessity itself. All modern exploration, space, ocean, digital, rests on that same defiance, the willingness to measure what others dismiss. His brass cylinder was the prototype for every sensor that now protects astronauts and commuters alike. The chain from that one device stretches to the ISS, to Mars probes, to the quiet algorithms correcting drones in turbulent air. The line is unbroken. Perhaps the word pointless deserves redemption. To call something pointless is often to confess that we cannot yet see its point. His test seemed futile only because its purpose lay beyond immediate vision. In hindsight, pointless was the highest compliment. It meant he was exploring where logic hadn't caught up. True discovery always begins there, in the margin between ridicule and revelation. Historians still debate the exact number. Was it 280 pilots, 302, 318? The archives are imperfect, but numbers in this case are symbols. Each stands for a life that returned from what should have been a dive to death. One became a farmer, one became a schoolteacher, one named his son Morris. Each of them carried, unknowingly, the continuation of an engineer's question. The human family tree owes one of its branches to a line of ink on paper in 1944. In 2015, researchers recreated Hugonin's experiment with digital sensors. They mounted microprobes on a restored Mustang and dove over Duxford again. The data matched his within fractions. The air still behaved the same. Truth had not aged. As the aircraft leveled out, the pilot radioed ground control. Trim stable, just like the notes said. And for a heartbeat, the decades collapsed. Hugonin's hand might as well have been on that trim wheel. The moral is simple, yet vast. Listen first, measure second, believe last. He listened when others shouted. He measured when others guessed. He believed only when the data sang harmony with intuition. That triad, attention, evidence, humility, remains the formula for survival in every discipline, not just flight. In a world addicted to certainty, his story is a hymn to doubt. Late historians often say the sky has no memory. They are wrong. The sky remembers every act of understanding offered to it. It rewards those who ask gently and punishes those who demand. Morris Hugonin asked gently. The air answered by sparing lives. That is the oldest contract between man and motion. Stand today on the grass at Duxford. The hangars are museums, the runways quiet except for weekend shows. Yet when a vintage Mustang dives during an air display and pulls out smoothly at the bottom, spectators cheer. They do not know that inside that recovery lies a ghost from 1944. They hear the engines roar, but not the whisper beneath it. The whisper of a man who once proved that listening could be louder than speed. That whisper is the true sound of progress. It says softly but eternally, the test was never pointless.